Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Owl Talk podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Camilleri. Today, Grand Second Counselor Christian Miele is here with me to talk about how our founders were involved in the United States military. Thanks for being here, Christian.
Hey Jacob, thanks again for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's a pleasure. So, being, kind of a military background fraternity, can you kind of share some of the insights into the military background of Sigma Pi's founders and our early members, and how their experiences as military cadets influenced the early principles of the fraternity all the way back in 1897?
Yeah, absolutely. The roots of the fraternity are indeed, there's that conspicuous sort of military tie and connection from the very beginning. So obviously, our listeners on this podcast who are Sigma Pi brothers know that the fraternity was founded at Vincennes University in 1897. Vincennes, of course, is a small town, a rather small town in southwest Indiana. And at the time of the founding, actually, let's say about 6 years before the founding, it was roughly 1891, I believe, when military instruction actually became a part of the curriculum if you were a Vincennes University student. And so the requirement then, if you were an able-bodied male student, was that you actually had to serve in the cadet company as part of your curriculum, really. So that's why you'll sometimes hear our founders and earliest members referred to as cadets, because the male students, those who were able-bodied, again, they had to serve in this military department of the academic institution. So, as part of the research we're undertaking in preparation for the release of Volume 1 of the history book of Sigma Pi, it's now believed that there were as many as 19 original members of the fraternity, if you include, the Vincennes University English professor Clarence Stevens, who of course was made an honorary member based on his influence over the founders and helping them, establish the organization. And in terms of, original members, what I mean by that is not the founders. Of course, there are only 4 founders, but it was long believed that there were just 10 original members, or, AKA those who joined in the winter and spring terms of 1897. But through our research and finding newspaper accounts and other source material, we've determined that of the 18 original student members, obviously not including the professor who was number 19, 17 of those 18 original members appear in the academic catalog for 1897 as members of the university's cadet company. And so interestingly, every single officer of that cadet company of students at Vincennes University in 1897 were in fact, every single one was in fact a member of Tau Phi Delta. And so the fraternity has from its very earliest days had those strong military ties, and all of the leaders, every single, interestingly, if you look at all the cadets at the university, every single one above the rank of private was in fact a member of Tau Phi Delta. So all of the leaders were fraternity members. Of course, the following spring, 1898, that's when we had the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, and consequently, the members of the VU Cadet Company would then volunteer their services as a unit and would be mustered into service as Company L of the 159th Indiana Volunteer Infantry. And so, of the people that volunteered, 3 members of the fraternity were among them. So obviously, founder William Raper Kennedy was a member of Company L, Maurice Bayard, one of our first 2 initiates, and then Lee Purcell. They would all join this effort. Purcell was actually appointed as second lieutenant, so he was the highest ranking member of the entire company, which had over 100 men, with founder Kennedy, serving as quartermaster sergeant, and Maurice Bayard, he was just serving as a regular sergeant. But interestingly, we found that, Purcell's sister, coincidentally ended up marrying founder George Martin Patterson. And then William Raper Kennedy, of course, would go on to have this really prolific military career, retiring ultimately at the rank of lieutenant colonel not long before his death. So in terms of the founders and the early members, again, they were very active in military service and actually, as very young men, went off to fight a war. Even though they ultimately wouldn't see combat in the 1898 Spanish-American War conflict, they nonetheless signed up to serve their country. So that's a really interesting part of our history.
Yeah, awesome stuff there, Christian. No, you kind of touched on it a little bit already, but can you tell us about the roles of Sigma Pi men in Americans' foreign wars, and how that impacted their chapters back home?
Absolutely. So yeah, there was a major impact many times on based on the war situations we found ourselves in as a country. There was a significant impact on both chapters and on the fraternity at large. And so, as I mentioned, Sigma Pi men played a very conspicuous role in every military conflict since the Spanish-American War. In fact, the first convocation ever postponed was the one scheduled to be held in 1918. And because World War I broke out, they postponed that convocation, and so they had a combined convocation in 1920. Though the First World War, which spanned 1914 to 1918, didn't necessarily have a disastrous impact on the fraternity compared to the Second World War. College enrollments were certainly greatly reduced by the First World War, and that led the Grand Sage at the time, a brother by the name of William Akers, to take emergency measures to safeguard the future of Sigma Pi. And active chapters at that time operated on more or less a skeleton basis. And interestingly, Nu and Xi chapters received their charters in the spring of 1918. But unfortunately, Kappa chapter had to surrender its charter voluntarily the previous fall, as literally all but 3 of its members had entered the military and naval services of the United States. And so, World War I definitely had an impact, not as great an impact as the Second World War. But, we did find in our research that a brother from Gamma chapter, his name was Thomas Barrett, he was an aviator. He was the first Ohio state man to lay down his life and make the ultimate sacrifice in World War I. And so, that was something that, we hadn't really known, but then it turns out that he's actually, they actually memorialized him and other Sigma Pi's who passed away as a part of their military service in the Emerald. Of course, moving on to World War II, after, the U.S. declared war in December of 1941 after Pearl Harbor, that quickly brought about another sharp decline in membership, and that caused our Grand Council, which was then known as the Executive Council, to make provisions for closing chapters who were depleted of members, also to safeguard the assets of the fraternity. Omega chapter out west was the first to have its roster depleted altogether and to assume war dormant status. It was a special status that Harold Jacobson, who was the Sigma Pi executive secretary at the time, sort of created for chapters who, we weren't closing them or revoking their charters necessarily, but they, their members were off fighting the war. So Omega chapter goes dormant, and by 1943-44, during that academic year, half of all Sigma Pi chapters would be dormant due to the war. And then in total, 16 chapters were either totally or partially dormant during part or most of World War II. However, when the war came to an end, by the fall of 1945, after Japan surrenders and a lot of the veterans returned to their respective campuses, the chapters were quickly reorganized. And ever since, Sigma Pi men have continued to serve on the front lines. And I had mentioned Thomas Barrett, who was the first Ohio State student to pass away during World War I. Something similar happened, unfortunately, in 2003, when U.S. Marine and brother of our Epsilon Gamma chapter at Illinois Wesleyan, Ryan Beaupre, he passed away and was one of the first casualties of Operation Iraqi Freedom in March of 2003. And so, there's this theme of, brothers who are, sort of the first ones in, and oftentimes they had to make the ultimate sacrifice. But, we've done a lot over the years to recognize these men for their service, to God and man, as part of, as our creed suggests. And certainly we're very proud of all the brothers and alumni who have served our country.
Yeah, Christian, I couldn't agree more. And, very important to, highlight these men and, the sacrifice that they put on themselves and, this country. So really, really great to hear some of these stories and hear how our men continue to impact us on the local level, national level, and in our military.
Absolutely.
What are some specific values that you say or lessons from the military service that you believe the founders and early members of Sigma Pi instilled in the fraternity's early culture, and how have these values continued to shape the organization over the years?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jacob. In sort of reading the correspondence, we have a lot of correspondence from William Raper Kennedy, one of our founders, who was really sort of who we consider the first leader of Tau Phi Delta. He was the first, president, what they called the Royal High Mogul at the time. And, we have a lot of his correspondence to his parents when he actually went to the Philippines for the next military conflict that he would find himself in. And, the values that these guys talked about and just their character and the way they live their life, the values that sort of leap off the page are those of honor and loyalty, discipline, and service. And when you think about it, honor, loyalty, discipline, service, these are all values that are embodied in our creed and in the ritual of Sigma Pi. We talk about service to God and man. We talk about loyalty to the fraternity, in things like the Fireside Song. And honor is, obviously a value that's very prominent in our ritual, and loyalty to one another. But obviously, them having a military background, they were highly disciplined, and that also speaks to their focus on scholarship and their academic success. When you think about 1897 Tau Phi Delta, they were as much a literary society as they were, a fraternity. So they were kind of a hybrid of both organizations at first, and so they were really highly focused on broadening their horizons, and they were focused on seeking and pursuing knowledge. And that discipline from the military really kind of grounded them in that. And so they were so just focused on, becoming sort of the Renaissance men of their time. And so they kind of did it all, right? They spoke many languages. They were able to, understand the Greek classics, and they took Latin, and they served in the military. And they were just sort of, for guys who were as young as, 17, 18 years old, they were pretty worldly and cultured. But yeah, those are some of the values, Jacob, that I think definitely you can kind of sense when you read their letters and correspondence, and when you think about their kind of dedication to their country as well as their alma mater.
And Christian, that Sigma Pi, we always try to honor our veterans. So can you kind of talk about some of the ways that Sigma Pi has honored and supported veterans and members with military service backgrounds throughout our history?
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, starting with the early editors of the Emerald on up to Chris Carter, our VP of Communications, who basically has been serving as editor-in-chief of the Emerald. We'd have to ask him. I think he's approaching one day. Hopefully, he'll get the record for most issues under his editorship. But in the pages of the Emerald, we've always done a really good job of highlighting the service of our military veterans. Many times you'll have like Ryan Beaupre, who I mentioned earlier, our late brother from Epsilon Gamma. He was featured on the cover of the Emerald after he passed away in the Iraqi freedom conflict. And, they would actually, Byron R. Lewis, our Grand Herald Emeritus, Honorary Grand Sage, who was, one of the early fraternity historians for Sigma Pi, put together a full military history with a chapter on each chapter of Sigma Pi, and made a list of all the members of those chapters who were serving in the military as a way to let everybody know just how many Sigma Pi's were serving in World War I in particular. And then, of course, in more recent times, there was a wholly led alumni effort to raise money to erect a Sigma Pi Veterans Memorial monument, which was on the grounds, which is still on the grounds of the Mitchell House, where our previous headquarters was located. And so that was done through the Veterans Committee. And so that was one very visible and sort of outward way to honor our veterans who have served.
And then kind of last question here for you, Christian. Are there any notable Sigma Pi alumni who have made significant contributions to the military or veterans causes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's, one that immediately comes to mind is Major General James Livingston of our Alpha Delta chapter at Auburn. I believe he was a 2-star general in the United States Marines, and he actually won the Medal of Honor. And so that is such a rare award of distinction for a service member to receive. Usually it requires some extraordinary, valor or some sort of really brave or courageous act during a combat situation where they are nominated and then actually awarded that by the President of the United States. And so James Livingston definitely comes to mind. And then I mentioned the Sigma Pi Veterans Committee that was headed up for a long time by Mark Reed of Alpha Chapter. Both of these men are Founders Award recipients. And so, obviously they and then other, Sigma Pi veterans over the years for their military service have been sort of recognized with various Sigma Pi awards and accolades. But yeah, when you think about just how few Medal of Honor recipients there are, for us to have one is pretty special.
Yeah, I cannot agree more, man. That's actually really, really cool to hear. And maybe there's a few listeners out there who didn't know that. So now there's a new nugget for them to learn about their organization.
Absolutely.
That'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for joining us on the All Talk podcast. And thank you, Christian, for your historical insight on our fraternity. For everyone listening, make sure you hit subscribe and please leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. And as always, I believe.
I believe.